The last known photograph of Timothy Caldwell is blurred, almost unintentional. A frail boy's face stares back through cracked glass, eyes hollow yet fixed on something unseen. The caption beneath it, written in faded ink, reads, "New Haven Orphanage, 1867. For 8 seconds, that's all you see. His face, still, silent. But if you stare long enough, his expression seems to move, as though something behind the eyes is alive, reaching forward." History barely remembers Timothy. No official birth certificate, no surviving family records, and yet his name appears in a series of sealed letters stored for decades in the Yale Medical Archives. Letters that were not meant for public view. They describe an orphan boy untouched by nature's law. A boy who did not eat, did not sleep, and whose body resisted decay in ways physicians refused to speak of in public. On October 13, 1867, Timothy Caldwell disappeared from his locked room inside the orphanage. The door was still bolted, the windows barred, the mattress unbroken. What remained was not his body, but the outline of a child's form burned black into the wall itself, as if something inside him had seared itself outward. The New Haven Orphanage sat on the edge of Connecticut's salt marshes, its foundations sinking into damp soil that swallowed the dead quicker than the living. Established in 1841 by Reverend Silas Hargrove, it was meant to serve as a place of refuge for children displaced by the cholera epidemics. But locals whispered of the orphanage in tones reserved for graveyards. By the mid-1860s, townspeople spoke of children seen at the windows at hours when the dormitories were supposedly locked. They described strange hymns carried across the marshlands at night, voices too low and guttural to belong to children. The Reverend's reports to the diocese painted a different picture. Healthy youth, full of discipline and piety. Yet scattered records from town physicians revealed disturbing contradictions. Malnourishment, bruises patterned like symbols, and fevers that left no trace on the skin. Timothy Caldwell arrived in the spring of 1865, placed there after his mother's mysterious drowning. The papers state she was found floating upright in the Mill River, mouth open, eyes fixed skyward as if she had seen something at the final moment. Timothy spoke rarely. When he did, he asked unsettling questions. Why do the bells ring if no one is inside the church? Or, where do the children go when they stop crying? Nurses often found him standing motionless in the courtyard, staring into corners as though someone invisible stood there with him. 2 years later, he would vanish in the most impossible of circumstances. In November of 1865, mere months after his arrival, the first incident was recorded. A nun, Sister Agnes, was found unconscious in the chapel at dawn. Her hands pressed into the stone floor so hard her fingernails had torn away. She awoke hours later mumbling Timothy's name. She swore she had heard him singing in the chapel long past curfew. But when she entered, the boy was not there. What she found instead was a sound, described as a single note that bent the air like heated metal. She collapsed, and when she regained her senses, the boy stood over her, silent, his face expressionless. After this, Sister Agnes' behavior deteriorated. She grew paranoid, refusing to enter rooms without first scattering salt on the floor. She began speaking of shadows with mouths, claiming they lingered wherever Timothy had been. By March 1866, she had clawed at her own eyelids in an attempt to unsee something she would not describe. The church quietly transferred her to an asylum. The Reverend silenced all questions, insisting Sister Agnes had suffered from hysteria. But Timothy's reputation among the children was sealed. They whispered that he could walk in dreams, that he appeared in their rooms at night without footsteps, that he knew secrets about their families no one had told him. The most unsettling detail comes from one boy's diary, recovered years later. When he looks at you too long, you feel your own thoughts stop, like he's emptying you to make space for something else. In early 1866, Yale physicians began visiting the orphanage under the guise of routine examinations. Records suggest these visits were prompted not by concern for the children's health, but by Timothy specifically. His file, labeled Caldwell, anomalous, describes abnormal heart rhythms, absence of fever despite infections, and a disturbing lack of aging. His body appeared unchanged from arrival to disappearance. The doctor's reports grew increasingly frantic. One noted, pulse irregular, almost absent. Pupils dilate at unpredictable intervals. Patient does not respond to chloroform. The church allowed these examinations, but insisted they remain private. Local newspapers never mentioned them. Yet one journal entry, written by Dr. Elias Ward, survives. I fear what this child is. He knows when I am about to write. He finishes my sentences aloud, even as I think them. Ward attempted to transfer Timothy to the New Haven Hospital, but was denied by both church and orphanage board members. Days later, Ward resigned his post and vanished from the historical record entirely. What remained were scattered rumors among townsfolk, that Timothy's presence was a curse, that livestock sickened near the orphanage, that even the marsh water turned black where he bathed. By the winter of 1866, the atmosphere around the orphanage had shifted. Children spoke less. Hymns grew quieter, and Timothy Caldwell became less of a boy and more of a symbol of dread, of silence, of something ancient reawakening beneath New England soil. The most damning evidence of what happened next comes not from official archives, but from a private collection discovered in 1932. Inside a box of decayed linens and prayer books was a black leather notebook, its pages brittle but legible. The author is never named, but the handwriting matches several entries from Reverend Hargrove's sermons. The notebook details the boy who will not diminish. It describes nights when Timothy sat upright in bed, unblinking, while the other children slept. It claims his shadow moved when he did not, that sometimes it stretched across the room toward the others. One entry chills the reader. He is not possessed. He is possession itself, a vessel waiting. The others are afraid, but I see the Lord's trial in him. He is chosen, though by what hand I cannot say. The Reverend's writing shifts from awe to terror. Later pages describe hearing Timothy's voice when the boy's mouth never opened, words echoing from the walls. You keep us here, you feed us prayers, but you do not know who listens. The notebook ends abruptly in August of 1867, 2 months before Timothy's disappearance. The last entry reads, his body is no longer necessary. He has learned to move without it. Children at the orphanage began reporting voices at night. Not the hushed murmurs of restless bunkmates, but voices from beneath the floorboards, from inside the walls, and most disturbingly, from within their own thoughts. Several diaries later uncovered from former orphans described the same experience. Waking in the dead of night to hear Timothy's voice. His tone was calm, almost comforting, but his words were unbearable. You don't belong to them. You belong to me. I can show you where they go when the bells stop. Some children wept until morning, others refused to sleep, and a few, always the quietest, always the ones with no family left, began following Timothy around the orphanage, as if bound by invisible thread. By spring 1867, 2 children had gone missing. Officially, the record claims both died of marsh fever and were buried on the grounds. Yet their graves bore no names, only wooden crosses. Testimonies from the surviving orphans suggest otherwise. He told us they weren't gone, just not in their bodies anymore. Timothy himself never denied these accusations. When asked, he simply stared, his eyes glassy but intent, as though the question itself was beneath him. One child described his presence like this. When he stood too close, I felt smaller, like I was inside myself watching me from far away. The whispers grew louder, and with them, so did the suspicion that something inside the boy was not human at all. The Catholic diocese, pressured by frightened townsfolk, sent 2 priests to investigate in July of 1867. Their arrival was met with both relief and dread. Relief that someone in power acknowledged the fear. Dread because it confirmed the orphanage's dark reputation had spread beyond its walls. Fathers O'Malley and Kavanaugh spent 3 days at the orphanage. Their private journals, now preserved in restricted church archives, reveal details no one else recorded. They described Timothy as polite, almost gentle. Yet during their first interview, Both priests reported feeling a suffocating stillness in his presence. O'Malley wrote, "The boy does not blink in ordinary time. When his eyes close, they open again before the lids meet." On the second night, both priests heard what they described as chanting. Believing it came from the children, they searched the dormitories. Every child was asleep, except Timothy, who sat upright in bed, whispering into the dark. The voices continued long after they left his room. The priests recommended immediate removal of the boy from the orphanage. Their request was denied. Reverend Hargrove claimed that Timothy was part of God's mysterious plan and forbade interference. 2 weeks later, Father O'Malley was found drowned in the same river where Timothy's mother had died. His lungs, the coroner noted, were filled not with water, but with something thicker, blackened silt from the marsh. The diocese never pursued the matter further. By late summer of 1867, the entire town of New Haven seemed paralyzed by unspoken fear. Residents avoided the orphanage road, even in daylight. Farmers reported livestock collapsing overnight, their carcasses found with mouths stretched open as if in frozen screams. Merchants whispered that Timothy's face was seen in shop windows, though he never left the orphanage grounds. A schoolteacher swore she saw him walking through her classroom at dusk, though every door was locked. The authorities were petitioned repeatedly to intervene, but every request disappeared in bureaucratic fog. It is suspected, though never proven, that Yale's physicians, along with the church, pressured officials into silence. One letter from a town councilman, never sent but later discovered in his estate, reads, "We are told to keep quiet, to let the boy remain where he is. But I have seen children vanish. I have seen mothers grow pale and speechless at the mention of his name. This is no child, it is a wound in the earth." The silence became complicity, and complicity would allow what happened next to unfold without resistance. The final night began like any other. Rain tapped at the windows, the marshes groaned with wind, and the children were herded into bed. Timothy was locked in his room, as always under strict supervision. At midnight, a nurse making rounds reported hearing faint scratching from his chamber. When she looked through the keyhole, she saw Timothy kneeling in the corner, tracing something on the wall with his finger. She described it later as a circle intersected by countless smaller lines, each one pulsing faintly with a light she swore was not candle flame. Terrified, she alerted Reverend Hargrove. When the door was opened minutes later, the boy was gone. The room was empty, the window barred, the mattress unbroken. What remained was the wall. Burned into the plaster was the outline of a small body, arms outstretched, head tilted, exact in size and shape to Timothy Caldwell. The smell of sulfur lingered for weeks. The children screamed. The nurses wept. Reverend Hargrove insisted this was the work of the devil. But others whispered that the devil was not powerful enough to take a body so completely. Timothy Caldwell had vanished. But those who remained swore they still heard his voice in the halls. Within days of his disappearance, the orphanage locked its doors to outsiders. Officials declared Timothy dead, though no body was ever recovered. The official cause, fever and wasting. All records were sealed. The blackened wall in his room was plastered over. The Reverend insisted on silence from both staff and children. Those who attempted to speak out found themselves ostracized or worse. Several nurses who left the orphanage reported being followed at night, their names whispered in unfamiliar voices. One was found dead in her home, her face turned completely toward the ceiling, jaw unhinged as though still screaming. The church urged townsfolk to forget the boy, to pray instead for their own salvation. And gradually they did. Fear turned into denial, denial into silence. By the turn of the century, Timothy Caldwell's name was all but erased from public memory. His story lived only in fragments, rumors, forbidden journals, sealed letters. Yet the shadow of what happened in 1867 still lingers. For every generation in New Haven since, there are whispers of a child seen at night, standing in doorways, watching from marshland fog. They say if you hear your own name spoken in a child's voice when no child is there, you have already been seen by him. And Timothy Caldwell never forgets. In the years after Timothy's disappearance, the surviving orphans carried scars no one could see. Some refused to speak of him at all, as though naming him might bring him back. Others grew obsessed, convinced Timothy had not vanished but lingered in the edges of their lives. By adulthood, several of the orphans were admitted to asylums across New England. Their case notes share eerie similarities. Hallucinations of a boy standing in doorways, insomnia driven by a voice that repeated their names at night, and the compulsion to draw circles, always intersecting lines, always incomplete. One woman, Margaret Ellis, wrote letters until her death in 1904 describing what she called the hollow child. She claimed Timothy visited her bedside every year on October 13th, the anniversary of his disappearance. "He is smaller now," she wrote in one letter, "or perhaps I am larger, but the eyes have not aged. They watch me as if waiting for me to agree to something I do not yet understand." Another orphan, Thomas Hale, turned to the church for solace. He later confessed to priests that Timothy's voice interrupted his prayers, mocking them, finishing the Psalms before he could recite them. In his final confession, Hale whispered, "He says the prayers aren't to God, they're to him, and he is listening." Whether delusion or haunting, the orphans lived in Timothy's shadow until their deaths, and their testimony, scattered across decades, paints a disturbing truth. Whatever Timothy Caldwell became, he never truly left. Reverend Hargrove, who had once defended Timothy as God's trial upon us, suffered perhaps the most grotesque downfall. After the boy's disappearance, the Reverend's sermons grew erratic, filled with strange symbols scrawled across his notes. Congregants described him speaking in languages no one understood, his voice breaking into tones like metal tearing. Attendance at the orphanage chapel dwindled until only a few nuns remained. By 1872, the church quietly removed him from service. His last written record comes from a confession scratched into the back of his notebook. "He did not leave. He is the hymn now. Every word I speak, he hears first." Hargrove disappeared that same winter. His house was found abandoned, the fireplace filled with ashes of burnt sermons. The only surviving object was a single sheet of paper pinned to the wall, bearing a circle intersected by dozens of smaller lines, the same pattern described in Timothy's final hours. The church buried his memory with silence. To this day, no gravestone for Reverend Hargrove exists in New Haven. It is as though both master and pupil were erased in equal measure. Though the church suppressed public knowledge of Timothy Caldwell, Yale physicians continued to study him long after his disappearance. Archived letters between faculty members suggest the boy was considered a phenomenon of great promise, though none dared explain what that promise entailed. One letter, dated 1879, hints at a larger conspiracy. The boy's case is not concluded. His absence does not negate his effect. We must document how he persists, how he infiltrates memory itself. The body was never the subject, only the residue. By the 1890s, psychology departments began receiving anonymous donations to fund research into collective hallucinations of youth. Several surviving orphans were discreetly interviewed under the guise of medical examinations. Their testimonies, hearing Timothy's voice, seeing his shadow, were filed away as group hysteria. Yet one memorandum, and signed, reads differently. "This is no hysteria. This is a continuity of presence. The child is an aperture." Yale's archives hold hundreds of sealed documents labeled Caldwell. Their contents remain restricted, but the fragments we have suggest the institution was less interested in curing fear than in cultivating it. By the turn of the century, October 13th had become a cursed date in New Haven. Every year, strange occurrences surfaced. A child found standing outside the orphanage ruins with no memory of how they arrived. Families reporting voices calling their children's names at night. Livestock discovered dead in the marshes with eyes wide and blackened. Newspapers rarely printed these stories, dismissing them as superstition. But oral tradition preserved the warnings. Never walk alone on October 13th. Never answer if you hear your name called in a child's voice, and never look too long into the marsh fog. In 1907, a a young reporter from the Hartford Courant attempted to investigate the abandoned orphanage. His notes were later found scattered across the floor of his boarding room. The last page read, "The wall is still burned. It is warm. Something inside the plaster moves when I listen." The reporter himself was never found. October 13th became not just an anniversary, but a ritual. As if Timothy Caldwell had made his disappearance into a permanent scar on time itself. In 1932, nearly 70 years after Timothy's disappearance, the black notebook was uncovered during a renovation of an old church library. Dust-covered and brittle, it contained Reverend Hargrove's final writings, the ones describing Timothy as possession itself. The discovery reignited whispers of the forgotten case. A historian named Dr. Lawrence Pike attempted to publish a paper on Caldwell, arguing that the boy represented an untold chapter of American psychological history. Weeks later, Pike withdrew his paper without explanation. Colleagues reported he had grown pale, unresponsive, muttering only one phrase over and over. "He knows I know." He spent his remaining years in silence, never writing again. The black notebook was locked away in Yale's restricted collection. To this day, its pages are accessible only to select faculty, none of whom have ever spoken publicly about its contents. But every so often rumors emerge, of students who broke in, of photocopies that circulate briefly before vanishing, of a single phrase written in Timothy's childish hand across one of the last pages. Not gone. Listening. By the 1930s, researchers studying unexplained disappearances began noticing a disturbing pattern. Every few decades, in towns across New England, small clusters of children went missing under mysterious circumstances. The dates often fell close to October 13th. Though no official connection was drawn, whispers in academic circles linked these vanishings to Timothy Caldwell. Survivors of the New Haven orphanage described his ability to move without his body. Some believed his disappearance had allowed him to spread, no longer bound to a single room or a single form. A chilling report from 1937 described a Rhode Island orphanage where 3 children vanished in one night. On the dormitory wall, caretakers found faint scorch marks shaped like a child with arms outstretched. Officials called it fire damage. Locals called it proof. The notion grew that Timothy had become less a boy than a contagion, something that infected memory, silence, and institutions willing to hide what they could not explain. Those who studied the case most closely began to suffer themselves. Night terrors, paranoia, sudden muteness. One psychologist wrote in his journal, "It is not the boy we fear, but the idea of him. He is thought itself watching us think." By 1940, the New Haven orphanage had been abandoned for decades. Weeds consumed its foundations, the marsh crept closer each year, and the town avoided the site entirely. Yet stories persisted of strange lights glowing from its broken windows, of voices echoing through the reeds. A group of Yale students, curious about the legend, entered the ruins one October night. What they found was not decay, but preservation. Timothy's old room remained intact, as if untouched by time. The plaster wall, once repaired, now revealed a blackened outline again. Fresh, as though burned that very night. One student returned the next morning, pale and trembling. He would not speak of what he saw, only that it followed them out. His classmates disappeared from campus within weeks, withdrawing from classes, leaving no forwarding addresses. The lone survivor transferred to another state and lived in near-total isolation. In a rare interview years later, he said, "It wasn't a haunting, it was an invitation, and they accepted." The ruins were demolished shortly after, but locals insist the marsh never reclaimed the land. Instead, the earth remains barren, as though something still waits beneath it. The closer we look, the clearer the silence becomes. Every church that touched the Caldwell case kept its records sealed. Every medical institution that studied him erased its files. And every newspaper that once reported his disappearance quickly withdrew coverage. This was not negligence. It was intention. Documents now suggest that Yale, the diocese, and even state authorities understood the danger of speaking his name too freely. Fear spread not just of Timothy himself, but of what belief in him could cause. If enough people remembered him, if enough people spoke of him, perhaps he would grow stronger. One chilling memo, unearthed in 1946, states simply, "He feeds on attention. Starve him with silence." But silence is never perfect. Families told stories to children. Survivors whispered warnings on their deathbeds. And in the cracks of history, Timothy Caldwell persisted, waiting for his name to be spoken again. By the mid-20th century, America had moved on. Wars, depressions, and new horrors filled the public consciousness. Timothy Caldwell was all but forgotten. And yet, scattered reports continued. In 1949, a child in Massachusetts was found standing in a cornfield at dawn, his lips moving silently. When asked what he was doing, he replied, "Listening to the boy in the dark." In 1950, a woman in Connecticut awoke to find the words, "Not gone," scrawled on her bedroom wall in what appeared to be ash. She lived alone. Even now, whispers surface online. Stories of children speaking in voices not their own. Of burn marks appearing on walls without fire. Of photographs where a pale boy stands just behind the subject. Most dismiss these as urban legend. But history tells us legends often begin as something real. Something too disturbing to survive the official record. Today, Timothy Caldwell is not in textbooks, not in sermons, not in medical journals. But his absence is its own kind of presence. The silence around him has become part of the legend. A wound history refuses to touch. What we know is this. A boy appeared in 1865 with no past and no future. He did not eat, did not age, did not obey the laws of the body. He changed those around him, emptied them of themselves, and left behind only silence and fear. On October 13th, 1867, he disappeared into the impossible. But the absence was not the end. Survivors swore he lingered. Institutions sealed their lips. And across generations, his shadow returned again and again, etched into walls, whispered in dreams, seen in the fog of the marshes. If you listen closely, too closely, you may still hear your name spoken in a child's voice when no child is there. And if you do, do not answer, because Timothy Caldwell is still listening.